Well,
I think it's the wrong way to think about it.
What do you disagree, if anything, with what he said so far?
Well, so far what he said hasn't been particularly revelatory. I think we have to step back for a second because, while the low-carb community might have a better understanding of where we disagree, I think the greater community that Joe reaches might not. So fundamentally what Stephan's saying and what the research community is saying and the conventional thinking in this field is that the brain, and correct me any point I get this wrong, but the brain does the fundamental job of controlling how fat we are.
Yes.
And the way it does it is by controlling or miscontrolling our intake and our expenditure. And the difference ends up in fat tissue. Is that fair to say for the most part?
Primarily intake, but yeah.
Yeah. So Stephan has a brain-centric view of the universe, and the community at large does as well. So if we go outside and we walk down, Ventura Boulevard, and we see someone who weighs 400 pounds, they've clearly taken in more calories than they should have over the course of their life. And it's been stored in their fat tissue, and Stephan would say that the problem is in their brain's ability to regulate intake to expenditure. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And I have to fix my headphones. So how are we going to do this? I'm getting feedback when I talk.
You getting feedback?
Yeah, it's just weird. Could be hold on one second. For those who don't know, I'm hearing impaired, as they say kindly. My kids would say deaf as a post.
Is that better?
So I took off my hearing aids, and it's a little better. Okay, so what I've been arguing, so I come along, my background, I'm a journalist. I'm an investigative journalist with a science background. Okay, that's what I do, and I'm curious. And I've got a lot of, my first two books were studying what's called pathological science, which is about people who got the wrong results in science, because a lot of times scientists do. So I'm very sensitive to this. And as I was doing the research for my first book, which took 5 years, what I noticed when you take a historical perspective is that the research community studying obesity was very focused on the brain. They just assumed that fat people are gluttons. And I'm going to use some socially unacceptable language because in part that's how they thought about it. In fact, when you read the obesity literature from the 40s and 50s, it's shocking the way these people talked about people with obesity, and the assumption was that they're gluttons or they're neurotic or they're anxious or they're just, But it was all brain-centric. Mm-hmm. And when they got to the 1960s, the field was being run by psychologists and psychiatrists who were trying to get people with obesity to eat less. And my favorite example was one team that was trying to they got the wives to stop having sex with the husbands if they didn't lose weight every week. And that would motivate them. I think even you point out that sex is a greater motivator in your book than tasty foods.
I didn't say it was greater, but I said it was on par. Yeah.
On par. So, and I'm going to just read you, I won't read you that. So there was this, while the obesity research community is focusing on the brain, there were people studying fat metabolism. Endocrinologists, they study hormones and hormone-related disorders, saying that the fat storage and fat mobilization, the burning of fat in the human body is controlled by this very diverse set of hormones and enzymes, and the nervous system is involved in and our body does a very careful job of basically orchestrating how we use fuels after we eat. And the implication was, and I think Stephan kind of stepped into this with the very first thing you said. So the assumption was obesity is a disorder of excess fat accumulation. So today, when you read the literature, the articles will often say obesity is a sort of energy imbalance. You take in more calories than they expend. There were still the best scientists in the field, the best physician scientists would say, look, obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation. Let's look at what regulates fat accumulation in the human body. Some people are programmed or dysregulated to store more fat. And if they store more fat, their behavior is going to respond. They'll be hungry, or they'll eat more. They'll be gluttons, all these things. So it was switching the causality. Instead of the brain determining energy balance and that determining fat accumulation, the idea was the sort of, let's see what regulates fat accumulation. If that's dysregulated, if I give birth to a daughter who weighs 100 pounds at age 4, I'm not going to worry about how much she eats and exercises. I'm going to worry about what's going on with fat accumulation in this young girl, that her body is just as if you give if you have a child who's 6'8" when he's 6 years old, you're not going to worry about how much he eats and exercises. You're going to worry that he's over-secreting growth hormone. So the idea, basically what I've done, my role in this is to say, look, in this vitally important period in the 1960s and 1970s, when obesity researchers came to understand, fat metabolism researchers came to understand the regulation of fat cells, the obesity people were convinced that the problem was in the brain. And those obesity people eventually grew into the world that Stephan got his PhD in, this neurobiological world where you study what's happening in the brain and you ignore what's happening in the fat cells and fat mobilization and fatty acid oxidation and fat storage. And when you look at that, you find a whole world of places in which people can be predetermined, be driven to be fat. So, for example, when I was in high school, senior year in high school, I weighed 195 pounds and I played football. And my brother, 2 years older, weighed 195 pounds his senior year and played football. And my brother never got more than 195 pounds. And I went up to 240. We both ate as much as humanly possible, as you could imagine. That's what high school athletes do. My brother was always lean. I was always chubby. My brother stayed lean and became an endurance athlete. I became a football player and I lifted weights. I put on muscle easily and I fattened easily. He didn't. The conventional wisdom would be the reason I went to 240 and he never got to 195 was that my brain was different than his. My argument is our bodies were fundamentally different. So if I see somebody walking down the street who weighs 300 pounds, I don't think about what the problem is with her brain regulating intake and expenditure. I think about why is her body driving her to be 300 pounds. So that's, I think, kind of the fundamental difference. And is it the brain that can't do the job, or is it the body that can't do the job and the brain is responding to what's happening in the body?
Yeah, is this a reductionist perspective? Because, isn't it holistically, you're looking at the entire machine of the human body. The idea that the brain is somehow or another separate from the body is...
I'm not saying it's separate. The question is the brain driving what's happening in the body, or is it responding to what's happening?
Yeah, so, and, the brain, of course, does respond a lot to what's happening in the body, and we can talk about that and how that works. But, I think we can tell stories, but the thing that differentiates a story that's true from a story that is not true is evidence. And so, you talk about the difference between your brother and you. This is where that genetics evidence comes back in that I was talking about. Your brother and you only share half of your genes. We know that genetics has a strong impact on who has a greater susceptibility to body fatness than others, and we also know what the genes do that underlie those differences.
No, wait.
And they are primary. I'm not done, Gary. Let me finish.
I just want to read something from your book.
Those genes.
Can I read something from
Nope, not right now. I'm in the middle of saying something. Those genes are primarily related to differences in brain function. That is what the genetics say, and so that suggests that the reason why you had a greater propensity than your brother to become fat probably has to do with differences in genetics that relate to brain function. That is what the research says.
But isn't it very difficult to parse out when you're talking about two 17-year-olds that weigh exactly the same amount? Like, how do we know how much they consumed in calories? We don't have any studies. We don't have any tests.
No, but I could guarantee you we both ate as much as humanly possible.
Right, but
actually,
maybe
my brother,
who
never got over 195, and I apologize for bringing you up on the air. I know you don't like that, used to say that he never gets stuffed. He just gets bored of eating after a couple of hours. Okay.
Okay, but
I mean,
maybe even though, like maybe if you looked at it scientifically, you ate more than him, or maybe you ate more sugar,
no,
or maybe you ate more carbs.
Well, so that's the difference. So those are the two hypotheses. One hypothesis is my body, and this is what Stephan is talking about. So I want to, just the thing I wanted to read, I'll ask you the question, how much of the variation in human obesity do those genes explain?
So if you look at the genetics of...
No, I didn't ask how much is genetic.
Gary, I'm answering your question.
Once
you need
he
to let
starts
me
talking, you got to let him talk.
Yeah, please, Gary. So if you look at the genetics of obesity, what you find is that from twin studies and family studies that measure the overall contribution of genetics, about 75% of the differences in body fatness between individuals is due to genetic differences between those individuals. So, 1995 America, if you just take a cross-section of people and you measure how much is genes, how much is environment, about 75% is genetic. Now, we've only identified a small proportion of the specific genes that underlie the propensity to obesity. And so if you look at the percentage that we have specifically identified, it's very small, and that's what I refer to in my book.
How much?
It's like, right now, I think it's up to about 10%.
It was 3% when your book was published.
Yeah, that's correct.
You're saying they did 7%?
Absolutely, yeah. The latest, actually, let me cite the study there. No, just a second. I'm going to cite the study. Just a second. I'm going to cite the study. The study is under reference number 2. So you can go check that out. It's about 10%. And these genetic studies are advancing very quickly, and that's why in the 3 years since I wrote that, we have explained a lot more than we did at the time that I wrote that. And so we have a portion of these genes identified, and what we're seeing is that most of that portion that we have identified relate to brain activity. And so that tells us that primarily the differences between individuals that determine differences in body fatness is about differences in brain activity. No one should be shocked about this. The brain generates all of our eating behavior. It generates all of our physical activity behavior, and it actually regulates body fatness. No one should be surprised by this.
I am, and I was.
And how are you surprised?
Well,
what do you disagree with?
Well, virtually everything. But let's begin with, I have to track back now. Okay, so drugs that explain obesity, 10%. With the argument that I was making and the argument I continue to make, imagine if, we'll take Stephan's car metaphor.
You see Stephan, he says Stephan.
Okay,
you say
sorry.
Stephan, right?
It's
Stephan.
okay. I'm not
It's
offended.
okay. But I mean,
apologize.
just
Stephan.
so people don't get confused.
Thank you.
If you take Stephan's car analogy, and somewhere in the 1970s, I've used the car analogy for this too, but I don't think it's as appropriate. But one way to think is somewhere in the 1970s, the aliens didn't notice that there were humans driving the car. So now they're trying to solve the problem without the humans involved. Why do some cars drive faster than others? And they come up with all kinds of hypotheses, and some of them can explain it. Even when they interpret the hypotheses, one of the common problems in science is called intellectual phase lock. So what I've been arguing is, in effect, the obesity research community left out of its research 1960s era endocrinology, the hormonal metabolic regulation of fatty acid metabolism, oxidation, burning. And as such, when they did it, pretty much everything they've done since has been interpreted incorrectly, just like the aliens would interpret the car problem if they never noticed the humans. So, and leptin is a good example. So leptin is discovered in 1993, and when leptin is discovered, obesity becomes sort of a legitimate field of science. Until then, it's a bunch of, actually mostly psychologists studying it, and now it becomes a subdiscipline of molecular biology, and all the molecular biologists jump into the field. And they assume that what leptin does is control the brain. It signals how much fat is available. It's some kind of satiety or fuel deficiency hormone, and as such, they study the brain, and they study the action of leptin in the brain. Now, in 2002, Jeff Friedman, who gets credit for discovering leptin, perhaps incorrectly, publishes a paper in the journal Science. It's saying perhaps as much as 2/3 or more of what leptin does is done in the periphery, in the body. And what leptin does is it's a hormone that sort of is secreted in response to how much fat you've accumulated. And then does it stimulate the brain to tell you to eat more or less, depending on how much fat? Or it also works in liver cells, which were the cells they were studying, and the assumption is it probably does in all cells, to tell your cells to burn fat. So it makes perfect sense. If there's fat available in the fat cells, now you've got a signal telling, sort of influencing the other cells of the body to burn fat. So now you've got a hormone that could work in the periphery, in the below the neck. Or it could work above the neck, but you've got a community that's almost exclusively studying in the head. They don't know there are human drivers down here. So that's what they do. So even in this world, I think I know the genome paper. Stephan is probably referenced on his website.
There have been a number of them, but yeah, that's the most
Harvard
recent.
group? Is it the?
I don't remember.
So they had two papers, because this is what you cited in the article you co-authored with Rudy Leibel. So I have two papers. One is genes associated with obesity, and one is genes associated with body type. So with body type, they're all below the neck. They're all, fat metabolism basically, and the genes that aspects of your body that you would expect to be controlled, like when you build up muscle and you have to take in excess energy to do it, it makes you hungry. I don't think your brain is regulating how much muscle you're building other than your drive to go to the gym. Basically, your body is responding to the stress on the muscle, all the things you do in the weightlifting. It's all below the neck. So the argument here is, again, simple. When these people looked at body type, it was insulin regulated genes for the most part, growth hormone, all these things. When they looked at excess body fat, they decided they were in the head. But the question is, when they looked, they're programmed to think that excess body fat is caused by overeating. So they look in the brain. Did they do the same kind? And I was going to call the researcher involved. I never got around to doing it, saying if body type, body shape is determined by these genes, then doesn't it make sense that excess variations of body shape are going to be determined by the same genes? And did you do the same kind of searches? I don't actually know how they determine where the genes work.
It's the same kind of searches. They just came up with different sets of genes. So they didn't start with any assumptions. They were just finding
No, but
whatever
the question
was there.
is where the genes work. So there's a common phenomenon in all this. Like with leptin, a gene that everybody thinks about working in the hypothalamus seems to work in every cell in the body.
Can I respond to that?
Wait, let me finish talking. Because you say this in your book. You say this in your book.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm prepared to respond whenever you're done.
Okay. In your book, you say that genes work. Yeah, the body is basically it puts different mechanisms to work in many places as it can. And there are these homeostatic feedback loops. Something happens, your whole body has to respond. So a gene that might work primarily on one cell is scattered all over the body because every cell, and it'll do different jobs on different cells. But if you think that the problem's in the brain, that's where you look. So you get this kind of intellectual phase lock where that's what we do, that's what we study. A neurobiologist studies the brain. Daniel Kahneman, Stephan likes to cite Daniel Kahneman as well, had this concept, what you see is all, he's a Nobel laureate, cognitive psychologist. What you see is all there is. Okay, and basically, if you're studying the brain, that's what you look at. If you're studying the gut, and so we all get trapped into that on some extent. And what I'm saying is, even in these studies, so Stephan wrote a book about the hungry brain that is supposed to be about obesity, but in fact, you never mention anything about the metabolic regulation of fat accumulation. It's just not there. And I would argue it has to be there, even if it's wrong. If it's not there, the absence of it. Like you can't talk about leptin without talking about what it might be doing in the body. You can't talk, so there's and it's put me in a very odd position. So Stephan is kind of the defender of the orthodoxy, and I'm the one who comes along and says, look, you guys you missed it. You screwed up. You had psychologists and psychiatrists running the field when the endocrinologist solved it, and then you discovered leptin, and it became a molecular biology problem. And you're now divorced from the very simplest observations about obesity. So we can do huge genome-wide association studies. They sound remarkable. But if I were to ask a simple question like, why is it I get fat here? The love handle thing, it's in the back with me. It's not in the front, but it's here and not here. I don't see what the brain has to say about that.
Okay. So as you mentioned, there have been different genetic studies that have looked at body fat distribution versus total body fatness. So total body fatness is what we're talking about when we're talking about obesity. Body fat distribution is what we're talking about when we're talking about the fat being on your hips versus on your wrist. Now, what we see is different sets of genes that come up. So body fat distribution, we actually see insulin related genes. So people that have a central body fat distribution, so body fat around their waist, tend to have these insulin related genes that are driving that. But when you look at total body fatness, the thing that causes obesity, what you see is that those genes are dominated by the brain. And the really cool point I want to make about the genetics research
10%
is that
of those genes might be dominated by the brain, if they looked.
Come on, Gary. It is unbiased. That's the really cool thing about it, is that this is whatever genes are popping up. These studies do not care about what you believe about what causes obesity. This is just whatever genes are popping up. So it's unbiased. Okay. And that's what they're saying. And I'm not done here, Gary. Now, I want to talk about, you mentioned, Gary, that maybe leptin is having important actions, not just in the brain, but in the body. First of all, I'm flattered that you read my book, and I'm glad that you acknowledge the existence of leptin now. This is good. But now you say that researchers focus on leptin actions in the brain because we're phase locked and we can't get out of our, blinders of thinking about it in terms of the brain, and that's why we focus on leptin action in the brain. The real reason we focus on leptin action in the brain is because it has been demonstrated that its effect on body fatness are via the brain. There are actual experiments demonstrating this, and I'll explain how these experiments work. This is all in the scientific literature. So if you knock out the leptin receptor only in the brain or only in the hypothalamus, you get obesity. So that is what tells us that actually the brain is the key site of action, and particularly this part of the brain.
It tells you the brain is a key site of action.
Please let him talk. He let you talk.
Yeah, and that's it. So, you get the same obesity if you knock leptin out of the brain, and particularly out of the hypothalamus, that you get if you knock it out of the whole body. So that shows that the brain is this site of action that is causing this to happen. And this is no surprise. We have these mechanisms worked out. We know specific groups of neurons that are receiving the leptin, that are controlling our appetite, that are controlling our metabolic rate. We have many of these neural populations worked out. In mice, we understand these systems so well. We can control specific tiny populations of neurons very precisely, cause them to eat a ton, to stop eating, to gain fat, to lose fat, like the animals are marionettes. That's the level of understanding we have right now of how these systems work. So, all of this evidence is converging on the same thing, that the brain is central and that fat cell metabolism, I'm just not seeing the evidence for that. Gary, if you want to cite specific evidence demonstrating that that is an actual cause of differences in body fatness between individuals in the general population, I'm awaiting that evidence, and I'm happy to sit here and listen to you cite the evidence that demonstrates that.